Hello there. We are going to look at the semi-final match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi. And we're going to dive right into game 1. So each mini match is 4 games. Each day 4 rapid games, 15-10 time control. And this is the first day, and there's another day tomorrow. If after these 2 matches the players are tied, we have a tie break. So let's go. First day of semifinals. Match 1, game 1. Magnus with white, and he opened with pawn to d4, as we already had on the board. And we had the Grunfeld defense, which Nepomniachtchi likes to play. Nepomniachtchi, Maxim Vasilyev-Graf, Peter Svidler, some of the leading experts when it comes to the Grunfeld. And well, in this first game, Magnus goes for this bishop d2 line. We already saw one pretty good game with this bishop d2 line earlier in the tournament, and Magnus employs this. The idea after e4, and if black captures, the idea is to take with the bishop on c3. We saw a good game by David Anton Guerrero, incidentally against Svidler, if my memory doesn't fail me. So bishop takes e3. The idea is to fortify the center with the bishop here and try to usually push the pawn forward and trade off these bishops, trade off this seemingly, theoretically, bad bishop for the good bishop. Okay, castles by Nepo, queen d2 by Magnus, and in Grunfeld style he now puts pressure on the center, all the pieces lining up against the pawn, and Magnus has to add a defender, and after bishop g4 he either has to play rook d1, accept the double pawns, or play the pawn forward as he did, and that's one of the main ideas in this bishop d2 system, to trade off these bishops. It looks like we're about to do that here after bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and g takes f3. Now the knight has to move, it moves to e5, and now a cheeky move by Magnus. He castles queenside, and well, isn't the pawn hanging, you say? No, it's not, because queen c3 attacks the knight, and the knight can't go back to this square because, well, it's going to be eaten up by the queen, so the knight would be lost if you take the pawn. So nice indirect defense of the f3 pawn. So Nepo goes on with c6 here, attacking the center, bishop h3, eyeing the c8 square, not allowing a rook to land there. And now still we have this indirect defense. There's still queen c3 check. So Nepo plays king g8, getting the king out of this diagonal where it's a little bit safer. So Magnus now plays queen c3 nonetheless, attacking the knight and defending the pawn. And here queen c7 should be a fine move here, and position should be around equal, I would say. Slightly better for white perhaps, but around equal, according to the computers at least. But queen b8 was the move that Nepomniachtchi played, and that turns out to be a fatal mistake, because Magnus has a nice tactical blow here. Now queen b8 is based on a tactical trick. If you had played queen c7, you would have protected this square d7, so you could retreat your knight. But Nepo wanted to be clever, and his idea was that if white attacks the knight here, which does not have the d7 square, it does however have the d4 square. Because if you take with the bishop, I take your pawn with check, you have to move, and then I take the bishop. And black should be quite happy. Actually, in this case, with the king on b1, I can actually flick in, taking this pawn and then taking the bishop. So that's a tactical trick that was supposed to save the knight. However, after the very nice tactical shot, d6, black is in a world of hurt. The knight is attacked. We threaten to take the pawn, or even push it to d7. And after he takes d6, which was played, f4 now actually does win the knight. So black is, just basically more or less lost, especially against the world champion. Nothing to be done, and the rest of the game was simply a formality. a5. Magnus didn't even have to take the piece yet. King b1. True class, you know, not to take the piece immediately. Take it only when you have to. f4, hitting the rook. It's just a full piece up here. He couldn't take, if we go back, Magnus even leaves the piece here, but he would play rook d1 here and no defense to rook d8. Winning the house. So after this, there was queen e8, bishop e6. Pretty nice move, and now he doubles, and he just wants to play rook d7 and mate him. And if queen f8, there's rook d8. So this ended the game. If queen here, simply rook here pins the queen and wins it. So a nice game by Magnus, although it was decided by a very bad blunder by Nepo. But Magnus was tactically alert and he found it. Now game number 2 was drawn, but let us move on to game number 3. Magnus again with white. Again we have the Grunfeld. Let's just play these moves. d4. This is game 3. We have the Grunfeld again, and this time around Magnus goes for e4. He's now leading 1.5/2, and now we have more of a main line with c5 here. Magnus though doesn't play exactly the most common move. He plays h3 here. The idea is not to allow, of course, this pin and defend this pawn. Castles, bishop e2, knight c6, and bishop e3. Idea, of course, to protect the pawn. We have a trade and queen a5 check. We now have twofold repetition. Magnus blocks the check, goes back. We have another check, and well, I guess Magnus was happy with a draw here, leading in the match. So Nepo could have forced a draw here with queen a5, but he wanted more, and he played queen c3 check. Still Magnus blocked, and now queen b2. And here Magnus goes for a pawn sacrifice. This pawn, of course, is under attack, so either you have to do something about it, defend it, and then allow the checks, or play what Magnus did. He played rook b1 here. So this cat and mouse game with the repetitions, it has ended, and the gauntlet has been thrown. d5 and knight d5, and now Magnus castles. So for the pawn, white has slightly better piece activity, rook on the b file, good central pawns first and foremost, and black will try to bank on the extra pawn, and sometimes the a pawn can be a big trump. But let's see what happens in the game. Nepo first trades on f3, and we have a5. Bishop f4, and the idea is to push the central pawns. Computers do not like this. They want to play queen c1, claim that white is okay. Should be around equal, but the thing it does, it positions white a bit better to be ready to meet the advance of the queenside pawns. This plan, bishop f4, a4 and e5, is very ambitious, but seems like the computers don't like it. And here very quickly Nepo is now pushing his a pawn, and it's starting to look very dangerous indeed. Queen a4, rook a1, Nepo gets the bishop out, rook a2, trying to double finally, and we get the double at queen b3. So this pawn is a big nuisance. Bishop d1, queen trade, and at this point I think it's safe to say that Magnus's strategy in this game has certainly backfired, and Nepo now undermines the center. He plays g5, hitting the pawn. He wants to take this e pawn, and after g takes f4, well, he probably will. Let's see. Bishop c2, rook attacks the bishop. We have a trade, and bishop takes e5. So at the moment Nepo is 2 pawns up. He still has this pawn, and he's attacking this pawn. White decides to eliminate the dangerous pawn, and then we get the d pawn. So 2 pawns up after all of this, and it should be a winning ending. But Magnus is well known for his defensive capabilities and resources. Let's see how he gets along in this one. Maybe it's too much. King G7. This might be a little inaccuracy. I think it's a good idea in general just to play f6 and have the bishop defend it. That way, if white wants to trade, you can always just take back with a pawn and you improve your pawn structure. After this, here, if you play f6 now, there might be takes and rook check picking up the pawn. So after b5, white manages to trade off on e5. Nothing bad, but at least he has a pawn and a rook ending now, and these pawns are doubled, so slightly less valuable, but still it's 2 pawns up, and we do have a pass pawn. So still should be good for black. Rook b2, king g6, bring in the king, and Magnus can't do much here. He has to bide his time here, just wait for black to do something. He can't even take the pawn, because then black would simply play rook f5, force the trade, and win because of the outside passer. The passer runs and you go for the pawns and you win the endgame. So king f2, Magnus just has to wait. King f3, rook c5. Same thing if you take the pawn, so he keeps on waiting. Same thing with the pawn on f4. If you take with the king now, there's rook c4, again forcing the trade. So Magnus keeps on waiting. Rook e5, rook back to b4. Again, if he takes, there's a trade. So yeah, the game is progressing slowly here. Finally, we have h5 here by Nepo. And at first the computers aren't thrilled with this decision, but I don't think it's spoiling anything. Rook a1, rook d5. Magnus tries to get active now with the rook, and Nepo tries to go for his pawns. Rook b8. And yeah, the question is if this was a good idea. Maybe we could just go for something like f5 here for black and simply try to play something like this, then play b4. Let's say king d3. We can play b4 or king e5. Maybe king e5 first. We go behind the pawn, we play b4, and we're just threatening to penetrate with the king. Up 2 pawns, this should be good. This is probably winning still, but now all of a sudden it might not be. Magnus gets a pawn, now it's only 1 pawn, and even though you're getting the h pawn, it's not enough. King g4, and where are you gonna go? Here, check, rook back, and it's hard to make progress because the rook is so tied down to the pawn, you can't activate the rook. And there are certain positions where it's easy to, well, not easy, where white can defend against an h and f pawn. And here, especially with the rook completely tied down, it's very difficult to get active here. King g3. You see the rook can never move. King g5 check. f5, rook a5, rook b1, but now you lose the h pawn. And then it's just a dead draw. All Magnus has to do is to demonstrate the Philidor technique. At the moment, Nepo is not allowing him, so that way he can put the king on g2. But rook a4 now, and let's see, king g3 stopping him from advancing the pawn. Rook d3, rook f4. He's now hitting the pawn, and yeah, nothing to be done. Nothing to be done indeed, and they agreed to a draw. So this was the third game. Magnus still leading after the win in the first game, and turns out this game right here was Nepomniachtchi's best chance to tie up this match. In the fourth and final game of day 1, they played at Berlin, and long story short, Nepo didn't get anything, and it was clear as early as like move 12, 13 that Magnus was going to get an easy draw, which he indeed did. And he takes day 1, leading the match now 1-0, and Nepomniachtchi needs to win tomorrow to force the tiebreak. He did it before in the quarterfinals. We saw actually 3 people come from behind and then force the tiebreak. But can he do it against the world champion? We'll have to see tomorrow. Again, I'd really appreciate if you liked the video, if you liked it, and you want to support me. But either way, I hope to see you again soon, and yeah, bye bye.